Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, and looking onto your own screen and being fascinated that we have again Nicole F. France with us. After a long time, we had to share them with a lot of other people. Now she made herself available to have a friendly chit-chat for an hour on a very fascinating topic, such as will AI and content management systems open new perspectives in the light of CX? And coming from the real world, Nicole just shared that she is in the middle of all the drama and all the excitement and all the perspectives, no longer being in a larger enterprise environment, but in the creative, let's say, perspectives of sunshine and thunderstorm on the one and the other end. And having had a career in a lot of fascinating companies, lately at Content-Erstellung as being evangelist and director of content, she has been in the tech industries as analyst with Gartner and Constellation Research, has been a certain time with Fujitsu working in the US and Europe. So she does know what's going around in the world to a certain extent. Now, welcome, Nicole. We are very curious about your even being a tech enthusiast. How, if somebody is getting so down to earth in transition phase and having a lot of fantastic opportunities created with the perspectives in life which opened up, just go for it. What did I miss in your introduction, Nicole?
Oh, thanks, Rob. You didn't miss much at all, but you hinted at what I've been spending the last few months doing, which is not the typical corporate gig, that is for sure. I have been perhaps not very visible, but I've definitely been very busy, working largely on the family businesses. So as many of you know, about 3 years ago, my other half bought a commercial building in a little town called Bisbee, Arizona, that happened to have a 7-room hotel on the top floor. So we've been running that as kind of a side hustle. And in addition to that, he's decided to open up a waffle and coffee restaurant in some of our retail space downstairs. So things have been pretty busy and pretty exciting, I have to say. It's been a lot of work. Part of it is preparation and planning. Part of it is going back and, trying to rationalize some of the business management stuff that might have been a little bit overlooked because we've both been so busy in the last few years. But it's been fun and exciting, and it's a very different kind of outlet. One of the big changes is going from being in a significant size organization that has teams of people to do all the things, and now suddenly having to do all of those things myself. One of the things that I have been trying to prioritize is marketing our little restaurant, or our new little waffle shop, marketing our hotel a little bit better. And it's a very, very different proposition when you go from having a team of people that you brainstorm and collaborate with to having to do everything from soup to nuts yourself. So if anybody wonders why you haven't heard or seen from me very much, that is a very big reason why.
Deliver in speed is now a tricky thing, and you now know how to optimize a lot. Sorry, Thomas.
Looking at it from a marketing angle, now that you said marketing and doing it all yourself, not having a team to do brainstorming or having someone to execute stuff that got prioritized or created. So how does that relate to the content creation career that you have, the content management career that you have? And in how far does AI help you in that endeavor now? Or generative AI?
Oh, well, no, I mean, the continuous thread here is that content still is equally important in this type of marketing to the kind of stuff that I've been doing in thought leadership and other types of corporate IT and executive engagement type of work. So it's very, very similar. The outputs are different. I think again, the audience is very different, but it is equally important to understand your audience and know what matters to them and what's going to capture their attention. It's also a question of understanding where they are likely to be and making sure that you show up in the right places. And again, content is pretty central to that. So we still have quite a bit of work to do with our little businesses, but this is a big part of the plan going forward, is how can we do things like highlight and promote the other local businesses that we have? Because if you come to stay at a hotel, you want things to do, you want places to eat, you want to know what the interesting things are to do around town, what's the entertainment going on, what are the interesting highlights that you really need to see. So this is an opportunity to not only do some kind of casual joint marketing with a whole bunch of our friends and neighbors around town, but also to help educate people. And I think that's got the added benefit of showing up in things like SEO and also things like all of these AI tools as well, ChatGPT. I will say as well, Thomas, I'm anticipating part of your next question, but I will say definitively that one of the big things that has been filling the gap of a team to collaborate with is in fact ChatGPT. So, I do a lot of back and forth and brainstorming with ChatGPT.
Why ChatGPT and not Gemini? Out of curiosity.
I guess because I've got a little more experience with ChatGPT. So I found it works pretty well, but I'm looking at experimenting a little bit more with others. Gemini potentially, but certainly Claude as well.
Your name does suggest that you could be Francophone, so Claude could be your friend as well.
It could, in French or in English. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, rumors say that those tools speak different languages. Yeah, quote unquote.
Yeah, exactly. It is interesting. I mean, as soon as you start getting into translating stuff, it's a different game too, right?
That works fairly well as well. So just from a brainstorming point of view, I said, welcome to the club. What I'm using for preparing these types of conversations sometimes is also brainstorming, getting some additional talking points, for example, getting a synopsis created and then translated. So this is quite part of a workflow these days. But let's combine that a little with your local. Well, the waffle shop is a local business, unless you want to distribute nationwide.
No, thank you. No, we're very much planning to keep it a local business.
Yeah. Cold waffles.
Yeah.
With melted ice, in how far, I mean, this is not exactly a great use case for a website. In how far are people, what do people back there in Arizona use for this type of communications? Is WhatsApp or Business Messenger, also Apple Business Manager, is that a topic?
So we're just in the early stages. We're still building out the waffle shop, and we haven't officially opened yet. We're still a little bit far from that, several weeks for sure. But it's interesting because honestly, people are very much on social media. So this is where people find out about what's going on around town, especially if they're not there locally. I will say the interesting thing about Bisbee, Arizona is that to this day, one of the most effective places to find out what's going on is all of the local telephone poles, because people stick posters up on them. Yeah. It's great if you're there. It's not great if you aren't there. And so social media is the kind of equivalent, especially for anyone who's further afield. So we know we need to promote ourselves on social media. Yeah. We will have a website too, because I think one of the other things is that we fully expect people to do remote ordering as well. And they may come in to pick it up, but they probably, especially locals, often want to order in advance. So we should do a whole separate episode on small hotel and restaurant tech, but we don't have to do that.
This now brings us fully into agentic software. Why not having the ordering process fully on, without a website, fully on?
It would be
And
great.
this-
And one of the things I'm looking at is, can we do this in social channels? You know, can people go and order on Instagram? Because that's probably where they're looking at us. So
You
we'll see.
can, you can, and shameless plug, I know a vendor, a startup vendor that could help you.
Well, we'll
Shameless
talk later, Thomas. We'll talk later for sure.
And the other aspect is that we, in our last conversation with Clint, came to the point how important it is to have an interactive approach with an application which is in the ease of use of the former Apple world, such as I don't have to think much. I ask, I get a recommendation. Yeah, just 5 minutes around the corner is that lovely, nice hotel with a waffle shop. And you can also pre-order. Yeah, and the suggestion of the day is da 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 da. Yeah, that is what I am looking for. Yeah.
I think a lot of us are, you know, and I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're getting closer and closer to that.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And I recall just the experience when I was a lot younger, without my wife and kids, and was traveling the US. The first touch point was the tourist office, and that tourist information and all these black and billboards where they had informations collected, and you save some money, coupons. So I am still a bargain hunter, and I'm very fond of.
You're a German.
Yeah, okay. It's in my
DNA. Come on, I thought it was a Scottish thing.
I have some Schwäbish roots as well. Yeah, even the town is called after my name, Korb. Yeah, non-related, but it is very interesting to see what's possible in that kind of business, and thinking on the next curve, such as not only the waffle, but going for to dine in style or in a special take, such as very local, very family oriented. You just gave us a hint that you had some ideas.
Well, I will tell you, one of the other things we have on the back burner is a restaurant and bar. We're still brainstorming what that would look like before we wholeheartedly jump into this next level of insanity. But what we're considering is something that's like a different sort of take on the chicken restaurant, which anybody who's driven through the South probably understands very well. In our case, it would be mesquite rotisserie chicken. So that's what we're thinking about, with all kinds of wonderful sides that cater for a range of tastes and preferences. So it's interesting because I think the balance of being local and serving the local population, but also building a profile and attracting and appealing to tourists is a very interesting combination. It's something in a town like Bisbee, which is highly dependent on tourism, an essential combination, right? But I think what it comes down to is not only some good ideas and some creativity in how we communicate and position ourselves, but I think it takes that genuine commitment to an idea that makes sense, that is appealing. And so this is probably really germane to this conversation here around content and AI and how all of this is changing, because I think there is a very clear relationship between that core central proposition and idea and how we extend that. And I think that's kind of the relationship, if you will, between the creativity, the creative thinking, and how generative AI in particular is going to help us make the most of that.
And we are in the middle of that process where Thomas is always challenging me a bit, such as who is the owner of the experience? Who is the real beneficiary? Who is the one to judge if it was a good one or a bad one? And with having a hotel, having a waffle and coffee shop, planning for a restaurant and a bar, man or woman, you are collecting a lot of experiences. And out of curiosity, does your small town have a train station or something like a larger bus stop, like for Greyhound or something like that?
Wouldn't that be nice? No, it does not. The closest train station is in a town called Benson, which is about 45 miles away, about 45 minutes away. So we don't have great public transportation, which is unfortunate.
Okay.
There are shuttle services that go from some of the major cities, Tucson in particular, which is the closest major airport. So it is the kind of place that people typically drive to, and they're usually on a road trip. So that
is exactly the point, such as, where is already your billboard at the next most favorite gas station? And do you have plans to place a billboard where there is that sign at the exit towards your town, gas, food, lodging, go for Nicole's?
It's a great question, and this is a total tangent from our main conversation here. But I will say, one of the interesting challenges that we and a lot of our fellow businesses locally face is that we have a city council and a city manager that does not fully grasp the importance and value of promoting the town, and doesn't fully understand that, to your point about the visitor center, that's really not the way that you do it these days. Yes, it's important to have information locally available for the people that are there, but what does that matter if people aren't going to get there? So I think this idea of promoting the town using social media channels, this is something that is still actually an area where we as local businesses are honestly shouldering a lot of the burden ourselves, and we're trying very hard to educate our city on how to do that effectively. So it's, again, this is one of those areas where I think, as all of us looking at the technology sector, we forget sometimes that we're actually closer to, although it may not feel like it, the leading edge of adoption of this stuff. And there are still so many that are so behind in understanding and knowing how to use these tools. So here we are talking about generative AI. We're still actually trying to get our town to understand the value and importance and necessity of social media. So, there's always a continuum. And I think part of the requirement that those of us who have some knowledge and understanding of this space have is to help educate others and bring everybody along, because I don't think it's a recipe for success to pretend like this stuff doesn't exist, or to ignore it, or to assume that we can keep doing things the old way. And if anything, I think, the last year has shown us that the pace of change is very dramatically accelerating once again. And while we are very far from having all the answers, and I think certainly there is a long road ahead of us to understand how generative AI in particular is going to reshape our work and our lives and the opportunities that we have, we still are already at a point where the scale of that change is beginning to become apparent.
Being a hardcore AI user now these days, even if it's for benchmarking, team working, little challenges, and getting some ideas, what the time saving and cost reduction perspectives are one end, and the other is how easy to handle is it for you these days? You have already told us what is your favorite tool. Now, what is a typical process you try to run, and how do you feel the impact if something works nicely?
I think for me, and it's interesting because we talk, again, in the technology industry, we always talk about time savings. We always talk about, labor savings. We talk about the impact on reducing costs for the same or better outcomes. I think for me, part of what I see generative AI doing is helping me to do things that, frankly, I would have a hard time doing otherwise. There's not really a replacement for this. Now, will I still work with small agencies to do marketing stuff? Yes, absolutely. But I'm going to go in with a much more educated view about what I really want and what I think the plan should be, rather than going and just putting everything on the agency to help me do this. So I think it makes me a more educated customer, and it certainly means that I am paying more specifically for exactly what I need, as opposed to a whole bunch of stuff because I'm not a very educated customer. And I think one of the big questions here about generative AI is, what can it do that we couldn't do before? And I think you guys are very astute in posing this question, right? Scale and speed are certainly there, but I think the reality is that the degree of scale and speed means we can do things that previously really didn't make any sense. And I'm not talking now about my small businesses, because I think the fundamental question is always, what are the important things that you can do that really make a difference for the audience that you're trying to engage and for the objectives that you have to accomplish, right? Now, personalization, I think, is the thing where we are seeing the most constructive focus on generative AI in terms of how we produce and create and use content as a means of communicating and engaging the audiences that we care about.
Just please don't say hyper.
Yeah, and I think that the thing with personalization is still the big challenge is, what do you mean? What does it look like? What is good? What does good personalization look like, and who really cares, right? But at the same time, I think if you have a clear understanding of those questions and what you believe the answers are, the fact of the matter is generative AI can help to identify audiences and segments and to dynamically position elements of content in a way that would not be possible to do otherwise. I mean, we're talking about automation here, but we're also talking about interpretation. And we're not quite there yet, but we are making very significant strides. And I know this is one of the things that for Contentful was a very important decision in acquiring Ninetailed, which had been a very close partner. I mean, that's the entirety of what Ninetailed really focused on, how to use AI to identify audience segments and to mash up content that is going to drive the desired results with those audiences. So, honestly, we've talked about personalization for many, many years. I continue to have some of the same questions and challenges of what we expect personalization to accomplish. But even in light of that, the reality is we have a functional means to do it on a scale and with a speed approaching real time that would be impossible otherwise. So I think this is where we start to see some really big potential open up.
Just for the sake of challenging this, isn't that largely a matter of compute power? The algorithms for that have been there since the 60s, basically, last century.
I think you're right, but I think, Thomas, what has changed is the ease of use of the tools. And it's interesting because, again, generative AI even provides you the interface to make that easier because it's a conversational interface. And I think this is for me, and I think we probably talked about this the last time we chatted too. This is for me one of the most fundamental aspects here of what's changing, and that is the interface itself. Because increasingly what we have, and I think there is still largely a misconception about generative AI primarily being a tool for content creation. Okay, let's challenge that right there. Do I want generative AI to create a bunch of blog posts? Honestly, not really. It's happening anyway. Even for my little business, I'm not going to go in and just put in a couple of sentences and ask it to generate something. If I am going to use generative AI to help me create a post, I am actually going to give it some fairly extensive background and direction and guidance about what I want included in it, right? Yeah. So it's a much more involved process. That's not even where I think the most effective use is. It's in the creative thinking to get you to what the post looks like. And I think we all know a number of people who have gotten very good at using these tools to help them get to what is actually a really effective output, and is not generated by AI. But AI is involved in the production of it. Alan Berkson has some great posts recently from the Intelligist group about doing exactly this. I think there's also a tremendous impact in terms of the tools that we use. and the ability of generative AI to make the process of engaging with those tools and systems extremely intuitive and straightforward. One of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about when I was still at Contentful was the idea that, you don't have to be a content engineer or a designer to go and do mock-ups of something that is a, long-form content, for example. You can go in with a conversational interface, a Gen AI interface, and actually describe what you want. You don't have to understand the design system. You don't have to understand coding. You have to have, maybe a sense of what it is you would like the output to be, but you can actually work with tools that will undertake the heavy lifting, right? That will do that interpretation within those systems to get to an output that you want. So call this vibe coding if you want. I think the reality is this is what is dramatically changing our ability to produce good quality stuff quickly.
You used the word creative in various flavors a couple of times. So, and I often refer to Gen AI tools as derivative AI tools.
Yep.
So
Yep.
Where does creativity lie? What is creativity? And how does it probably change our own creativity? Unless we are also derivative tools.
Here you've got the great big philosophical question, Thomas. What is creativity? What qualifies as creativity?
Yeah.
I will say this, I think we are all in agreement here. Yes, absolutely. Generative AI is by definition derivative. Humans are also very much derivative creatures. We take inspiration from a lot of different places. We absolutely kind of regurgitate things that we've seen or heard or don't even recall consciously, but
Yeah.
things that have had an influence on us, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. There is, there's certainly a strain of philosophy that says there are no really new creative ideas. It's just a rehash of all the things or a reinterpretation of all the things. This is a long and interesting debate, particularly over a good cognac. But the thing is that I think where we're getting to is how do we use this inherent quality of generative AI effectively? It is derivative. Yes. Is that a bad thing? No, not if you know how to use it. So this is where I go back to, sort of the framing idea of this conversation was about generative AI and content, and how these systems and tools are changing. What's fascinating to me is that content management systems in general are still very focused on the end point, like the end creation of content. And whether you're breaking that into, constituent pieces and kind of an atomic approach to content or anything else, the point is the system is designed to manage all of that endpoint content. I would argue that we are increasingly getting to a point where we need to change our thinking about what the role of a content management system is, because in some cases we're talking about transitory endpoint content, right? Especially if it's dynamically generated. But more importantly, I think what we're talking about is that the endpoint content is less difficult and less valuable to produce than the core idea that you're deriving it from. So potentially content management systems need to be more focused on managing the thinking and the ideas and the originating substance, if you will, for what goes into something like a marketing program. And generative AI then is drawing from that source material to actually produce all of the variety of assets and instantiations that you need in order to actually execute on any sort of marketing program over time. So it's around the core ideas that we are creatively responsible for coming up with. And sometimes it's not even just a question of creativity. It's really a question of priorities and decision making. Who are the audiences that you want to go after, right? What do you know about them? What do you need to find out? What matters to them? Without the generative AI is never going to make these decisions. We need to be making these decisions, but we can use Gen AI to help us execute on those decisions.
30 years ago, read in the library, repeat, get into transformative new context, and your study paper was created. Now you can do this with a lot of more sources, very knowledgeable, as some helping educative hand. What you mentioned earlier is you go as a customer a lot more educated, better prepared to brief a servicing organization on one end, and on the other end, you learn about possible expectations of your own customers.
Yep.
And speaking for a very small town I live in, a cooperative of the small business people, which have found something, not a union, but like a club of the small business owners.
Like a trade association, a business association.
Exactly.
Yep.
Thank you,
Yep.
giving me the right word. They are the drivers which get the mayor of our small town really nervous, such as they push him. It's like they are the barking dogs which are running after the lonesome sheep and try to get him into the right direction. Yeah.
Yep.
So I encourage you that this is a useful way in self-organizing and setting some positive examples, as curiosity works also here. Yeah.
Yeah,
How do they
absolutely.
do it?
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
and you know, the beauty of this is when you, whether it's through the business association or whether it's through use of generative AI or even both, once you have some tangible results to show, it becomes much easier to move forward. And I think that this is where we are. And it's interesting to me to see the difference between, and we can use our small towns as examples. They're probably archetypes of organizations. I'm sure there are many businesses out there that operate in very much the same way. But there are the laggards who are really in a state of unawareness, and they don't know, they lack the knowledge. They also are potentially somewhat resistant to gaining that knowledge. And then there are those of us that are much further ahead. And I think a lot of what I have observed is, while there are certainly organizations that are trying to experiment with and adopt generative AI, I think in many cases it's unartful, if I can describe it that way. It's not very refined. It's not very sophisticated. I think most of where we see a lot of the really effective and sophisticated use is at an individual level. And I think it's where people are trying it for themselves. There might or might not be corporate tools that they can use. Increasingly, those corporate tools are, I think, becoming valuable and effective. But again, often those are established at the behest of a person or a small group of people that is taking the initiative to do it. And I think where we see the most significant and productive adoption of this stuff, it's typically happening at more of a grassroots level. I don't have any way of quantifying that. I'm curious if anybody watching this agrees or disagrees with that, but that's my sense just from what I've observed and talked to a variety of friends and colleagues about. But I think there is a groundswell of individuals who are using this, and I think that is already starting to change how we all operate.
And you mentioned social media, and in the context of the existing communities, such as church, school, gardening club, something what you have a old-fashioned book readers club. These are the communities. If you get involved there, and they learn to know you and your places, then you have the spreading of the news, and then you can use the new technology to go through old and new paths of communication.
Definitely.
So you became a CX hero.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that.
We can ask Annika Björk one day.
Sounds good.
A bit earlier, you said back to the roots for content management systems. So, I mean, they over the past 2 decades, quite a lot morphed into web content management systems. So will they become more of a kind of a knowledge-based system again, with an overlay of, let's say, generative supplied by rules and context that then creates me an individualized website?
Well, it's
What you
really
wanted to say?
interesting because you can argue that content management systems have always been very close to knowledge
Yeah.
management systems. And I think it's the challenging part is we talk about web content, but what we really mean is digital content.
Mhm.
It's just that most of the time that ends up expressed somewhere on a web page.
Mhm.
I see kind of an unfortunate trap still being very significant, which is people find it difficult to break out of the mindset of web content. And we really need to, because this content exists in all kinds of different channels, not just on web pages and websites. But having said that, if you talk to somebody like Carrie Hain or Don Collins, what they will tell you is, one of the challenges is that not all content is marketing content. Part of this is how do we understand the sort of ecosystem of content, where it's originated, what it's used for, what it can be applied to, and how do we think of that in a far more fluid way, but still with some kind of structure, because whether it's the technology tools and systems, including generative AI, or even the people, it's really hard to think about this stuff without some sense of structure. It's just not productive. So I think the structure that has emerged is really content modeling. You have things like taxonomies and schemas for content as well. And then you have the actual expressions of those things in the individual forms and pieces of content that get created. This is what I'm saying. I think this stuff still exists and is important. I think there are some interesting questions about the degree to which generative AI can either support or even obviate the need for some of this stuff. Anybody who understands knowledge management or structure will be, I think, eager to jump up and say, you can't leave the definition of that structure to generative AI, but it can be a very powerful tool in helping to create and maintain it. So that again is a longer conversation. I think it would be a great one to have with a few experts in this field, of which there are many great ones. But I think where we're seeing the potential for generative AI is exactly in helping to organize and manage content, to help create and refine some of those structures to make them easier. I think it can help in the production of that. And I think it also, going back to this idea of an interface, can help make it really straightforward for people who don't understand that structure and who honestly probably don't need to understand that structure in the course of their working days to interact with it effectively. And I think this for me is one of the great big areas. So there are two big areas I see as opportunity within what we call the content management space. One is to create these interfaces that really abstract away some of the structure from different types of users who don't really need it. Make it the right thing to do, the easy thing to do for that person accomplishing that job or role, right? And that requires a tremendous amount of design work and knowledge and understanding of not just who the users are, but what they're trying to do. That's particularly challenging in the current environment, because I would argue that we're in the midst of massive change in terms of what effective marketing even is. We can come back to that. The other thing that I think is a really important area of change that I mentioned earlier, and potential opportunity in content management, is recognizing that the core assets that we really need to be creating and managing are not the end content, but actually the original instantiation of those ideas, right? Like, what is the core substance? What is the core material that we're creating from which everything else is derived? That's not the way content management systems are currently designed to work.
Wouldn't they, in that environment or in that idea space, also be highly connected or depending on journey management? Because at the end, what you want is an outcome, not the ability, well, to just create the website or show the website. But you do that.
I think you're right. I think you're right, Thomas. But I think it's the combination of understanding how we as people work, how as humans we create and produce ideas and the thinking that is at the center of what it is we're trying to execute on, as well as the core components of how we manage to execute on them. So I think, yes, journey mapping is certainly important. I would argue one of the challenges of journey mapping is we try to make it very deterministic in a world where it is not. So that's a whole separate conversation, right? And the other thing is, like, those journeys ultimately come back to an idea of what it is. And you asked this question, I think, at the very beginning, maybe it was Ralph, like, who has the experiences? How are they defined? Who determines whether they're good or bad? And ultimately it's the recipient, right? But what is it you would like that recipient to feel? What kind of experience are you trying to provide for them? Why do they care about it, right? All of these are things that we ultimately are responsible for producing. That's the creative thinking. That's, that is the substance from which all of these other things can be produced. And if we do it right, these things interconnect really well when you have that core idea. I think one of the challenges that so many organizations have is that it's maybe not that hard to produce the constituent parts, but if they aren't tied together, they don't work very effectively.
Yeah.
Right. So having Gen AI produce blog posts is not really very productive. Having Gen AI understand that, you've got this long form representation of an idea of what matters to whom and why your business is tied to it, using that to then produce things is maybe a more effective approach, right? With a whole bunch of the inputs that are actually essential to communicating something that is meaningful and valuable to your audience. And that can take many, many different forms in many, many different channels at various points along the course of your relationship with them. So I'm rambling a little bit here, but I think this is the way we need to be conceiving of these systems and what they're trying to do. They're going to be most effective when they are designed to support the way we most naturally and effectively work. And I don't think we're quite there yet.
In that context, so for whatever reason, this comment that shows up in LinkedIn right now doesn't make it into our stream here. So I'll read it from LinkedIn. So we have Graham asking, so good old information architecture is still as relevant as ever. The academic IMRAD structure, introduction, methods, results, and discussion, isn't arbitrary. So, well, it's less of a question than a comment, but in how far would you agree or disagree?
Very much. I mean, information architecture is still the fundamental building block of all of this stuff. You can't do effective content modeling and management without good information architecture, right? Now, I think what changes in this world of generative AI is kind of back to this idea of scale and speed. I would argue that one of the most significant challenges with information architecture and knowledge management in particular has always been this issue of diminishing returns. You can classify everything, but is there any real value in doing that? I mean, the major stuff, sure, but you very quickly get to this very long tail of stuff that is small in volume, that is probably very minimal in terms of impact, that might have might have an audience of one. Does it matter to classify that stuff? Probably not. Can generative AI help us to change that equation? It can potentially. And maybe what it can help us do is understand where there are relevant aspects of content or information that may exist in a place that's disconnected from where we actually think it's most important. And this goes back to this idea, again, that not all content is marketing content, but there is a huge range of content you can use effectively in marketing. Stuff that we produce for marketing reasons also has other application in different parts of customer interaction, in business operations, right? But because it's not the typical thing to think of what we're producing in this context, we have these very significant boundaries and barriers that exist within organizations. Sometimes they're operational, sometimes they're departmental. We put up all these obstacles between these things, partly because we need to frame what we're working in. You can't do everything everywhere all at once. So we need to create some boundaries organizationally and as individuals so that we can get our arms around what we have to do, so that we can prioritize, so that we can determine what matters. But I think we're arguably on a point where these tools can help us to reconsider how we define that, and arguably to be way more effective in leveraging all of the things that we're doing across an organization anyway.
So
and maybe get better at determining what we should and shouldn't do, but that's a different story.
What you're essentially saying is that information architecture is even more important than ever, or than it has ever
but
been.
you know, like what you need the creative ideas, you need the inspiration in order for Gen AI to produce anything that's valuable. You need the information architecture, you need that structured thinking, you need that systems view in order to make any of the stuff really, really effective either. So there's a yin and yang in both of these examples.
Isn't it also about using the same, let's say, source material, source documentation, pictures, graphics, diagrams, whatever it is, in different contexts that then also need to get framed differently? So which adds yet another dimension on information architecture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one of the classic challenges has been that, you know, information architecture often ends up with a degree of rigidity that is essential. Largely because people need that consistency. The machines can reinterpret this stuff very quickly. We have a harder time doing that, right? So we need some degree of consistency in the information architecture, however you want to define it, you know, content model or you know, taxonomy or anything else, right? And yet there always needs to be a rate of change. And arguably, I think what we're getting to is a point where that rate of change we can maintain consistency, but we can also have some kind of temporary or occasional alternatives that help us to reinterpret that structure for a given need. And if you think about it, that's really what generative AI does. It's almost creating a taxonomy based on what the question is, as opposed to creating a taxonomy that exists in perpetuity.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to sort of get into. So an architecture, by definition, is something that is static. And different use cases, different users, and even changes over time impose a change of architecture, and probably even fast changes of architectures. And are you aware of any system that can support that already?
I mean, yes. How well is kind of the question, and it depends on where you're applying it. I mean, you know, I'm going to use the word that is what causes most people's eyes to glaze over, but in these circles of content structure and information architecture is, and you know, by the way, this comes from language, is this idea of ontologies, right? Ontology is the meaning, right? And ontologies do change and evolve over time. They're not static. But you know, these are the things that are actually really critical to get the balance right. You know, I think that part of what's really interesting about all of these more contemporary content management systems, not limited to Contentful, but Contentful is certainly one of them, is that you have a high degree of fungibility, because these are ways of managing content that are abstracted. They're not hard coded into endpoints. You can use that content anywhere in any digital channel. The question is really, have you structured it in a way that allows you to do that easily and effectively? And that structure is always going to be dependent to some degree on intent. What are you trying to do where, right? Those structures can change and evolve over time. But the fact of the matter is the limit really is only your creativity. And that is a blessing and a curse.
Now, creativity, there we are again.
I know, but part of this is, you know, these tools are highly flexible, and they're great in that if you have a vision of what you want to do, these tools make it very straightforward to do. I won't say easy; it's not necessarily easy, but it's absolutely possible, and it's way more possible than it would have been without these tools, right? Having said that, if you aren't really clear on what you're trying to do and why, the starting point is often very challenging. You know, like, well, what do I do with this? Well, you can do anything, but I don't know what I want to do. And I'm paraphrasing here and oversimplifying, but that is a very real challenge that customers of these tools have. The leading adopters have always had these visions for what they want to do. The real outliers, and those are absolutely creative thinkers. The reality is more and more organizations really want to be given kind of the roadmap or the handbook to say, if you want to do this, here's how you do it. Here's how you implement the system. Here's how you, here's your starter for structuring the content, for example. Here are the tools that you need. I think this is increasingly what organizations want, and it is still very challenging to put those pieces together.
In that context, this comment actually made it across to
Hey.
Again, so the single source publishing of reusable and reassemblable, oh my God, that's a word, content. So, I mean, it's around for quite some time. So I can remember Mindshift, that was 2012, 10.
But it's true. These things have existed for a long time. I think part of the challenge is, again, there's a very big difference between the creative process for producing content and the structure for managing and maintaining and reusing content. And I think there, again, is a huge opportunity for Gen AI to take the format of content that is most readily produced by us as the humans in conjunction with the machines, right? Don't get me wrong. It's not like this is a strictly binary approach here. But to take that, I will say in my experience, a long form report for me is some of the most valuable source material. I may never publish that long form report, but the discipline of going through and producing that is what forces me to develop the thesis, to find the supporting information, to structure the arguments, to find the illustrations, to identify the examples that help to convey the key points that I'm trying to get across as effectively as possible. This for me is the source material. Once I have that, then I can go and produce all these other things, and I can riff on that. I can create variants. It might take me to different ideas that I'm going to draw on from that. But that source material is key. That's not the way content management systems work, right? You've got the structure. You need to fill in all the pieces of the structure. Guess what I am not inclined to do on my own is go fill in all of that stuff, certainly not manually. And so I think where we end up is, going back to Graham's comment there, a system that makes it potentially way easier to connect the way we work as people with the way the people and the machines need to manage the content, right? And to automate a lot of that translation of, source material to structure that allows us to really quickly iterate and pick apart. And, a lot of this is the way large marketing organizations work. The corporate creative team has come up with this big thing now, like the team in Switzerland or in Singapore is taking that and interpreting it and pulling the different elements and reconstructing it for their local audience. Like this is the reality of how the stuff works. But we haven't really created the tools to support that. We can. I think we're actually really close to being able to do that.
What's missing?
I think a lot of it is the understanding of the audience and what the people using the systems are actually trying to do. And I think one of the fundamental challenges, and this is maybe a good point for rounding out this conversation here, I think perhaps the biggest challenge that all content management systems that I see face is that they, in order to be really effective for the organization and the people using them, need to support a wide variety of users with a wide variety of different needs and objectives. And that is very hard to design for. It means you have to have interfaces that are adapted to those sometimes very different needs and priorities, different ways of working, different levels of complexity that need to be readily available. So it requires on the part of the businesses and the people designing these systems to have a really deep understanding of a diverse set of audiences, even in a single organization. And, that's not easy to do.
Isn't that a prime possible use case for something agentic?
I think potentially, yes. I think that could very much accelerate the process as well. Because part of it is going back to something we've talked about here too, which is, identifying what that need is. And sometimes you don't know until you have queries coming into the system,
Yeah.
So I definitely think agentic capabilities have a huge potential to address this. But I'll go back again to the same idea of, the creative inspiration and the information architecture. Agentic alone is not going to solve the problem. You have to put the agents in service of a specific objective. And so that need from a design standpoint is still very, very much an onus on the humans leading the systems thinking.
Clearly it needs to be built, but an agent by definition, again, is something that works towards an outcome.
Yeah.
Well,
without an outcome, you can't do anything. Yeah.
As an agent for someone, yeah. So
Exactly.
So and this seems to be the technology translation of what you just said. So it would be interesting to see if someone or whether someone comes out of the woods with something like that.
I don't know, and I'm curious because I actually think that it's a coordination problem and it's an investment challenge. And I think one of the reasons is that it's very hard to stay focused on a small enough list of, let's say, audiences and their needs in order to really make significant progress in any sort of development roadmap. I think what we probably are likely to see emerge is something that looks a lot like the ecosystem that Salesforce was very effective at producing, where there were a whole bunch of other organizations that tackled specific problems and specific audiences and were developing on the Salesforce platform to serve those specific needs and audiences. And in many cases, Salesforce has gone back and acquired those organizations. So, personally, I think that's the way this model probably evolves most effectively. We'll see what happens.
So they'll come forward with an agentic content management system. Yeah?
But again, like the agents right? I mean, the core system needs to be open and able to support that kind of approach. But I think it's going to require multiple organizations to empower the digital agents to do what the humans define as the core proposition or the core requirement.
Yeah. So as we are approaching the top of the hour, so there is. Let's go back to content management systems and vendors, creators of content management systems. So if you, in your experience or out of your experience, would suggest them 2 or 3 things to do and 2 to avoid in the next 2, let's say up to 5 years, what would your recommendations be? I mean, you're not a rookie in that area.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think my top recommendation would be lean into the partner ecosystem, because based on what I've just described, and again, I will use Nine-Tailed and Contentful as an example that I know best. You had a close partner that was operating in very close concert with the underlying system as well as the business to create something that was a value add for audiences built in that ecosystem. And I think whether it's additional software companies or even agencies and services partners who are building their intellectual property into systems and tools, this is how you're going to build at a rate that is fast enough to be compelling and to create that market position. This is how you're going to get to that scope of things serving the range of audiences that I've described, because it is a long list of some very distinct and often very complex requirements. And I would argue that the simplest interfaces are the ones that have the most complex requirements in order to get there, right? So lean into the ecosystem. The other thing I would say is be very clear about, on the roadmap, the things that are essential to the core audiences that establish your position in the ecosystem. And again, that's easy to say, it's harder to do. These systems need to continue to evolve. I think the question is, as the sort of cornerstone of the ecosystem, what are the things that you need to invest in addressing that make it easy for everyone else in the ecosystem to do their part? We talked a lot about information architecture in this conversation. I think there are some very significant challenges in helping to bridge that divide between information architecture in concept and functional reality. Like these are still not problems that have been solved. There are still lots of challenges in terms of interoperability and actually being able to use digital content everywhere you want to and in all kinds of different ways. So, those are the challenges that I think very much still need to be solved. In terms of what to avoid, I would say avoid positioning yourself as serving an audience you don't understand, because I think that's a very quick recipe for pain and strife.
Okay, thanks a lot for this. And as a very first in nearly 5 years, I'd like to give an audience member the famous last words. Let's not forget that increasingly AI is also an audience.
Absolutely. I rammed right on. Yeah. And I would say, we didn't even get into this conversation about how marketing is changing, but this is one of the key elements in my mind to why and how.
Yeah. So thanks a lot to you, Nicole. And thanks a lot for Graham for his very good commenting. And well, seems like some more people are still listening in. Thanks to them too. And hopefully we can meet again next week when we are talking with Kishan Chetan of Salesforce about how AI and a service cloud or service business actually can get together in a mutually profitable way.
That'll be an interesting one for sure.
That'll be an interesting one too. Yeah, and Kishan, I mean, I know him since the early noughts, I think. He knows his stuff, so that'll be good. Looking forward to it. So see you soon, and let's go backstage. Bye for now.
Take care.